Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Divine Cybermancy for PC. Special thanks to MJ1284 who sent me this. It is greatly appreciated, so thanks. This is an indie first-person shooter / role-playing game hybrid that was developed and published by, I believe you pronounced it as Streum On Studio, but it could also be Streum On. But they're a French developer and they released this thing in July of 2011, and this was after having delayed it just a little bit. So it was already going into that you knew that there were probably going to be technical problems just because they had delayed it a little bit. But what we didn't expect was for the critics to hate this thing as much as they did. There was a lot of negative press thrown at it, which is kind of a pity because it's kind of a throwback to Deus Ex in some ways, and others it's not, obviously. But we were kind of expecting that out of it. We wanted this to be sort of a Deus Ex style game. We didn't necessarily want Deus Ex, but it was really trying to bill itself as something like that. So the question becomes, were these negative reviews all correct, or were they just overblown and completely ridiculous? Well, as far as presentation goes, it's kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have the environments, which really convey this great cyberpunk feel, and you have the character models, which, while the character models themselves are good, they just look weird. You're not really sure what to make of them. It's this weird mix of cyberpunk and fantasy, I guess is the way to put it. Like members of the order you're with wear all this kind of medieval-looking armor, and it really gets this kind of cool contrast between that and the tech aspect of things. So you have that, and you also have animations which are actually not very good. They're a little bit clunky looking sometimes, and in fact in other places they're just outright very clunky. But for the most part they do what they need to do to convey the action that they're doing, but they're just really unimpressive, and sometimes they're even a little bit awkward. As for the textures, some of them are really good, others not so much. It is a Source Engine game, and as a result, some of the textures are a little bit off compared to others, especially in the environment. So there is a little bit of problematic stuff going on with the visuals. It does have this very nice art style, which, like I said, cyberpunk mixed with fantasy that works really well for it. But everything just seems a little bland for the most part. There's a lot of brown and gray and a lot of blacks, and not much else in there. I mean, you get neon signs and such, of course. But the environments themselves are very sparsely populated, too, except for enemies. So you don't get a really living, breathing environment when you go into this thing. Which is kind of a pity, because the environments themselves are huge. I mean, they're absolutely gigantic. So there was a wasted opportunity with making these areas really come to life. They did have that nice art style to it, but ultimately everything feels kind of empty. Then you have the sound design. The music is this kind of techno thing that is very minimalistic, and it works okay for the game, but it's really unimpressive, I have to say. So that's a little bit of a letdown, but it's not that big of a deal. The voice acting, I don't really know what they're trying to say. It's either in French or it's complete gibberish, but the voice acting is pretty awful, to be honest with you. It's just they didn't really convey anything through their what they're babbling. They just kind of talk like this the entire time and get very boring very easily. So it doesn't really make any sense in that regard, and you do have subtitles and such, but I don't know whether they were going for a language that they actually knew, or whether they were just going for something that sounded different, or whether they were just being lazy with it. But the voice acting's pretty awful. Sound effects themselves actually are rather solid. A lot of the gunfire sounds nice and beefy, which is certainly a very appreciated thing. But for the most part, the sounds are a little stock. That's the only issue I had with them. They're a little stock. In some cases, they're exactly what come with the Source Engine itself. So those are very unimpressive. But otherwise, the sound design's kind of eh. It's not bad, it's not particularly great, it just does what it needs to, and that's about it. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story is where things just went all over the place. You play as a member of the Secreta Secretorum in this dystopian future. I think that's how you pronounce the order anyway. That's where you get the E.Y.E. It's the the order you belong to. But they're this group of basically futuristic samurai with cybernetics and psionics. I don't know, it's weird. It explains things in the game a little bit through like database stuff, but it's a little hard to sift through sometimes. You sit there and you're like, wait, what? Okay, what's the frame reference for this? And so the backstory is a little bit lost on you. You get more backstory than you do in the game, actually, through these database things. And so that kind of brings you up to speed. As for the story itself, it's basically the order that you belong to vying for power against the Federation, which is a group of corporations that are basically ruling humanity as we know it right now. And so it's just basically this war between your order and the Federation. That's kind of all you need to know. And in fact, the story just gets really haughty sometimes and over the top at some points, to where it assumes that you're impressed by its complexity, and it's really just a mess. The story itself is just ultimately very all over the place. It's very disjointed. You end up not really caring much. And ultimately, a lot of it just doesn't make any sense. And it could just be that it was lost in translation, because there are quite a few translation errors here and there, particularly in the dialogue, where people are talking and all of a sudden they say something that just looks completely ridiculous. And you're like, wait, what? People don't talk properly. It's a mess. And it's pretty obvious that the developers were not native English speakers. I have a feeling that if this thing were in French, if I spoke French and could play this thing in French, it would probably make a lot more sense. But the English version is just very hard to sift through sometimes. So that kind of leaves the gameplay, doesn't it? Since the story definitely doesn't do it for me. What about the gameplay? Well, like I said, it is a first-person shooter role-playing game hybrid. You get abilities that you can level up as you go through the game by either buying the abilities altogether or just getting research that will give you different bonuses and such. When you research something, you can set a number of scientists, and you have the in-game currency is Brazouf. And you get this cost associated with it, and when it says days, it really just means this number of seconds that you need to pass. It's basically whatever the number is times about 8 seconds. So it's really more of a matter of time to research these things and get the bonuses from them and such. But that's about as far as the role-playing stuff goes. You do get to specialize your character a little bit, but other than that, there's not a lot of role-playing in the story itself or anything. It's just a few elements here and there. But as for what this game really does for the most of the game is the FPS combat. They did really, really great shooting mechanics in this thing. Everything just feels just right, which is really surprising considering it's an indie game and you don't expect this level of quality in a first-person shooter from that. But everything just feels really nice when you're shooting it. All the guns feel kind of beefy. Well, not all of them, but they have their own ups and downs. You can really get a feel for what weapons do what. The melee combat is, well, it's not anywhere near as good as something like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. It's certainly not the worst I've seen. So the melee combat's kind of satisfying sometimes, especially when you get, I believe it's called the Damocles, where when you hit things with it, you get this explosion and they go flying. Really satisfying. And most of the weapons are like that in the game. They're just really satisfying to use. So the FPS combat itself, really well done. Problem with that, though, is that the enemy AI is extremely stupid. They basically just run at you in a straight line and get mowed down very easily. So that's a little bit of a pity. They really could have done much more with the AI and made the game a lot more fun as a result, and a lot more tactics thrown in there, as opposed to just sit there and blast things from like a mile away with your sniper rifle or whatever. But at times, you actually get the enemy being overly smart as opposed to just ridiculously stupid, in that they have pinpoint accuracy for the most part. So it makes it kind of hard in that regard. But other than that, the AI is pretty stupid as to what their tactics are. And that makes the combat a little bit less fun than it should be. And then there's, of course, the other feature that's interesting to this game. as part of your ability set, which includes all sorts of different things. You can cloak, you can do different types of jumping and such, but you also get hacking. And the hacking minigame is this very fast-paced thing where you need to bring the enemy's defense down to 0. And once you do that, you've hacked the item, you get the bonus resulting from it. Like sometimes you can, like if you hack a turret, for instance, it will no longer fire at you. If you hack a certain type of terminal, you'll get Brazoof from it, and stuff like that. And the hacking minigame is just really cool to play through, and it takes a lot of getting used to. That is the problem with it. It just takes a lot of getting used to really figure out what you need to do to actually get this thing working. And once you figure it out, though, it's pretty cool to play through. Here's the main problem with this thing, though. It's really bad at explaining how you play it. When you go into this thing, you do get a few little tips here and there that tell you that, okay, you need to do this. And you're sitting there like, okay, how? I get how I'm supposed to shoot things, I get how I'm supposed to interact with things, but what am I supposed to do with this and that and the other? I'm supposed to know what this does, I'm supposed to know what this does. What? And sometimes things become very confusing as a result. So the game does a really, really terrible job of explaining itself to the player. And so the player just has to figure things out on his own. And ultimately that's one of the major downfalls of it, because you'll have this period of adjustment which can take quite a while actually, and you probably will not be having any fun with that particular bit because of the fact that it just isn't very intuitive. I mean, once you figure out how to do things, you just get it and it's fairly simple to play, but learning how to do it is a complicated process, especially with such things as the hacking minigame. And so that presents a problem. It's not an accessible game at all. And so as a result, you really have to know what you're doing going into it. You have to have experienced things beforehand when you go into this thing in order to actually understand how to play it and actually get any enjoyment out of it. And that's an issue. Another major problem with this thing is that it is extremely buggy. Even with the delay they had, they didn't fix the bugs. I mean, it crashes a lot. There's a lot of weird glitches here and there, especially with the AI. They just glitch in and out of existence. It's a mess as far as technical problems go. And in fact, it took me a long time to actually get this thing working at all. It just wouldn't run, and I had no idea why until eventually I somehow managed to get it working. I don't even remember what I did to get it working, to be honest with you. It was just a mess to try to get this thing working. And once I did get it working, it still was buggy. So, it's a mess. They need to really do something about that. The DLC they promised that would be free, of course, it hasn't arrived. So, there's a lack of support from the developers, too. That's a pretty big issue. They've been basically silent since they announced that DLC back in August. Yeah. But, anyway, another thing that's in this game is the co-op, which I never actually played the co-op, so I can't really comment much on it. It's just basically going through the single player only with buddies. So that's all you really need to know about that. I actually hear it's pretty good, but I didn't play it myself, so I can't really comment on that. I figured this was mostly a single player game anyway. But ultimately, the main problem I have with this game is just that it feels unfinished. There's just so much lacking in it. I mean, while it does have really satisfying combat, while the hacking minigame is cool, the story is just a complete jumbled mess that makes no sense. There's a lot of translation errors. There's a lot of weird glitches and technical problems that go in with it. And the AI has a lot of issues. The game actually respawns enemies. Basically you'll look away from something, you'll turn back, and their enemies have respawned. So there's just a lot of weird issues here and there with game design issues. The RPG mechanics aren't exactly the best. They're not bad either, but they don't really work optimally. The game doesn't explain things to you. So ultimately, I had a hard time really enjoying this game despite its really good points. And ultimately, that's why I give it a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.